Well, it's that time of the program where it's time to get drunk and get high and find out all the problems that go along with it. Happy at this time to introduce Richard Anderson from SmartServe Ontario and Matt Maurer from Torkin Manes Law. We're going to start out with Richard. Richard, welcome. You're going to talk to us about some changes in the SmartServe program and some alcohol changes over the last few years. The floor is yours. Maybe just a brief introduction about yourself and your organization and what you do for us, for those that may not know you.
Certainly. Thanks, Dave, and good morning to everybody. Certainly a good introduction about getting drunk and high. I appreciate that, Dave. There's no question that the intent of a lot of our events is there's alcohol involved, and alcohol is usually to support a revenue stream, but also to support, adding to the time that you're having at your event. So I'm going to run through some changes that have occurred, but my background, I've been with SmartServe Ontario for the last 5 years as the executive director, and I've also had the opportunity to work in the post-secondary world for about 25 years, where I ran the licenses for the campus pub. So I certainly had an opportunity to see a lot of interesting things. So without any delay, and I'm hoping you can see my screen share, I'm going to run through my presentation. So there we go. And I'm sure Jay will tell me if it's actually not there.
It's there.
Anyways, all right, thank you. So I think it's important to note that there's still some things you can't do, and I'm going to try to shed some light in that in a kind of a humorous way. First of all is, just a quick history. SmartServe was established in 1995. And for those of you that have been in this business for a while, before 1995, there was a program called Server Intervention Program, which was run by the Addiction Research Foundation. And that, if you still hold that certificate, the time has come for you to refresh. SmartServe is mandatory training for those who sell, serve, deliver, or handle alcohol in the province of Ontario. Up until COVID, we were training about 100,000 people a year. We are a charity. A lot of people think we're a government agency. We are not. We get no government funding. And we support, in our charitable side, we support bursaries and scholarships at 15 post-secondary institutions. I'm sure it's no secret there's a huge skill shortage in hospitality and tourism. And our hope is by offsetting some educational costs for some deserving students will make a difference. And the other thing we have is a division called Drink Smart, and Drink Smart is really teaching students, again, post-secondary, about the dangers of binge drinking. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to highlight some liquor reforms that have happened over the last 2 years while we haven't been having our events. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the curriculum updates we have in our program, some digitization that we've done, and I'm going to wrap it up at the end with a little PSA that we created this summer. So why do you need to know? Well, obviously, you minimally know that by having alcohol at an event, you accept liability, and you have to apply for a permit, and you need to understand the rules and regulations attached to everything. And certainly, bottom line, how liability impacts your organization, but also you personally, if you're the person who has applied for the license. So the things I'm going to touch on, first of all, is the Liquor License Act is now no longer. On November 29th, the government approved a new Liquor License and Control Act. Why the name? They've now included cannabis in it. So these inspectors, which are now called compliance officials, who will visit you at your event, now will visit events and deal with cannabis and deal with alcohol and lottery, which, as if you're followed all the gazillion ads that are on TV these days, the province is opening up e-gaming and making it legal. During COVID, the current government announced a ton of changes really to support businesses. Many that were temporary are now permanent, and I'll be touching on what those are. So as a highlight, liquor takeout and delivery changed extensively. Farmers markets changed, liquor delivery, skip the dishes, etc. The hours were extended, and there used to be limits associated with brew pubs and wineries. All of these may not necessarily be of importance to you, but it's good to know kind of what's going on out there. Information like reduced pricing on spirits. There used to be a very set dollar figure that you had to sell your product for. You couldn't do happy hours. So again, we'll get into that. Alcohol sales on dock boats is new. Liquor delivery, again, you know that you can order some French fries and 24 beers if you want. Very interesting approach, but that is available. Extension of premises, that would be for all the patios that we're operating in the winter. And then enhanced social responsibility, and I'll speak to that. So let's move right in. So once upon a time, retail hours were 10, 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. This would be going to the LCBO or beer store. Now that it's in grocery stores, here's the funny story. So in the middle of COVID, they being the Walmarts and grocery stores of the world, were allowing seniors to enter between 7 and 8 a.m. so that they could do their shopping. The seniors got a little agitated because they were shopping at 7 a.m., but they weren't able to buy alcohol. So the AGCO and the government changed it. So now you can purchase, if it's available for sale, from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. At Brewers Retail, LCBOs, retail stores, in wineries and breweries, and of course, authorized grocery stores. So if you have to run out and get that special item on a rider, at least you have extended hours. Alcohol delivery or takeout, and this is again more for you personally at home, but you can order alcohol for delivery, or you can stop in at your local restaurant. And remember, the restaurants were only allowed to sell alcohol at 11 a.m. They can now do it at 9 a.m. And the push for this had a lot to do with, hey, if I want to have a mimosa with my breakfast, why can't I? That's really what pushed it. So must be purchased with food, and you can do, in this case, takeout. Minimum delivery fees are removed. The product has to be securely closed and not tampered with, and the licensee has to keep really detailed information on who purchased, etc. So that's that exciting one. Expanding the sale. So this is listed as pending, but there was legislation introduced to add more retail outlets. So we've certainly seen LCBO convenience stores. So if you're in a rural area and you see a convenience store, might have full LCBO options. There's more of them, more retailers, more big box stores. And in the last year and a half, 200 new outlets were approved. So it's just really about making it more accessible to Ontarians. Public consumption, this is an interesting one. So it came about that, the Conservatives wanted you to have the ability to go to your local park and bring a bottle of wine or beer or whatever. This is up to each municipality. So the region that you're in may allow this. And if so, you need to be aware how it may impact your event. So if your region allows wine in the park or alcohol, and you've got a closed off area that's selling alcohol for your event. So it's really important that you are aware of that and what the implications are. Reach out to your municipality. And it's also important to note that the Alcohol and Gaming Commission does not enforce this. It's up to local police or bylaw, which I know they were thrilled to have this passed to them. Special occasion permit holders. So the biggest change, which is a bit of a surprise to me personally, is not really about partition. So once upon a time you had to have fencing and all this stuff. They've changed the partition rules, so it doesn't have to be as onerous. And again, I would do your homework and read up on it. But the most important one is that the requirement to have sufficient supply of food is no longer required. And Smart Serve's totally based on the premise that if someone's had too much to drink, you should get some food into them. You should slow down their serving. I would still highly encourage you to have food available. And I would imagine the vast majority of your events would have food available. But once upon a time, it was mandatory. Now it's not. And the key, again, is to ensure there's no intoxication. disorderly conduct or promotion of consumption. And those are always the main things to consider when you're doing that. Tailgating event. So this was brought in as a new public event. It was for the purpose of being held outdoors in connection with a professional, semi-professional, or post-secondary sporting event. You may recall when the Raptors were in the finals, they had Jurassic Park, which was this big area that was open in front of the arena. That would have been a tailgating event. And that allows them to sell and serve alcohol. But it also allows people, and this is again your policy, that anyone 19 plus could bring their own alcohol into the area. And if you look at a standard tailgating type event at a sporting event and you're in the parking lot with vehicles, you know, as much as you're allowing people to bring alcohol, you're still responsible to ensure they don't drink and drive, that they don't have alcohol accessible in their vehicles. So this one's a bit challenging to deal with, and I certainly would encourage you to think twice about a tailgating event. The next one is by the glass. So again, this is, you know, if you are bringing on to your event a winery or a brewery that's sampling, and there's all kinds of rules attached to that, they used to only be able to do, I think, 3 ounces of wine and so many ounces of beer. So those rules have been removed. Again, you still have to follow the Liquor License Act or Control Act and regulations. You can't, you know, allow people to get intoxicated, permitting drunkenness, or providing alcohol to minors. So all those rules continue to remain. Advertising requirements. So once upon a time, you couldn't use the term happy hour and cheap drinks. However, you can do that now. So even at your events with your special occasion permit, you may choose during kind of slower periods to lower your price. You have the ability to do that. And in the past, it was very restricted on what you could or couldn't do. And, you know, you can, you still have to have, you know, proper advertising, pricing, and promotion so that it doesn't encourage people to drink extra or buy more beverages. And again, I know there's a lot of events that tend to control the alcohol as far as, hey, you can only buy 1 or you can buy only 2. And those are things obviously that try to encourage people to pace themselves and that you're able to monitor it more responsibly. So again, a lot of events and festivals don't particularly advertise, hey, cheap $3 drafts for the next 2 hours. However, if that was a strategy you were interested in while maintaining responsible service, there's a little more flexibility there. So let's talk a little bit about SmartServe. So SmartServe, again, is an online, fully online program. And some of the more recent additions is based on our research and evidence. So we've hired research, we've ensured that the information that's included in our program outside of the alcohol laws and regulations are you know, evidence-based. So we just recently added a module on sexual violence. It's a very much an introductory, but it speaks to the fact that, you know, when you're serving alcohol, your servers will see many things. And there's certainly been media about situations where someone may be leaving with a stranger, someone may be overly intoxicated, you know, and we're really hoping that in taking the sexual violence module that you'll be able to assist and use the team to have a plan and a process to deal with these situations. I will also note that those of you that have SmartServe, you can log into your account and take the sexual violence module for free. It's about a 15-minute module. It's pretty straightforward, but without having to take the whole program, that option is available. The other part that was new, and it's not so much new because it was added in 2019, was cannabis intoxication. And it's really important that as a server, that co-use is important. So, you know, whether intoxication's intoxication, it doesn't matter if you gave them 1 drink, but they came in already high or under the influence of prescription drugs or other things. At the end of the day, you are responsible for the patron, regardless of what they may have consumed prior. So we try to give some signs of use of cannabis intoxication. And certainly studies show that when you combine the two, it can certainly be troublesome depending on the individual. So bottom line is our goal is to continue to remain current and relevant to those that are in the industry. Moving forward, last year, we moved SmartServe certification cards totally digital and online. So if you have the old school card, certainly keep it. But I think it's important to know that you can now log onto your account and you can print off a PDF. You can load it onto your device, or you can print it off to give it to your employer. In the case of your events, I think it's important, if you don't already know, that whoever is managing the bar has a photocopy or copies of all the SmartServe certificates for all the people that are working. Certainly moving forward, we're going to continue to support liquor reform education. And again, I will highlight the fact that there was more changes to the Liquor Act in the last 2 years than there have been in the last 10. So it's important that this leads in nicely to the next one. Because of the number of changes, recertification has been approved by the government and by the Alcohol and Gaming Commission. So I think it's important that, it's 5 years, and anybody who expires will have a 1-year grace period, and I'll touch on that in a second. So first step, as of October 25, it's an e-certificate. You have access to it on it. It's accessible and convenient. You just go on and access your account. So that's pretty straightforward. And again, you can print it off, instead of having to pay $10, I lost my card. We wanted to make it easier for our users. Recertification. So effective July 1, 2022, you must be recertified every 5 years. Now, what does that mean? That means that those that hold a certificate prior to July 1, 2018, or as I alluded to at the beginning, a program called Sewer Intervention Program, you have 1 year to recertify. So you have till July 1, 2023. Now, on July 2nd, 2022, you expire 5 years from the date of your certificate. So, and it's important to note that the recertification price is considerably cheaper, but you must recertify before you expire. Otherwise, you have to pay the full price. And again, it's every 5 years. We have been lobbying for this for 15 years. We're one of the few provinces left that have added this. So there we will outline it again. So certificates issued before July 1, 2018 will expire June 30, 2023. Certificates issued after July 1, 2018 will expire in 5 years. Recert is $29.95. And if you know that you're going to need to recertify, even if it's in the coming months, I'd log in, register, and get your account all set up sooner than later. Community safety obviously is a big talking point for our organization. And I talked about our sexual violence program. So we partnered with the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers to offer that sexual violence module for free. And when you're done taking it, we're asking you to make a donation if you're able to, and we're going to match donations up to $10,000 and donate that to the OCRCC. No obligation, and if you're interested, we certainly welcome the support. And I'm going to wrap up with a little video here that hopefully will play, and we'll go from there.
Things seem to be getting back to normal for these connoisseurs. Now you can go and taste or drink some fine vintages again. Ah, a return to normalcy for these two lovebirds. Now you can finally have that specialty drink your favorite bartender is known for. Pace yourself, though. It's been a while. Now you can hit the town again, sharing stories together for the crazy year we've all had. But you still can't do that.
So thank you very much. And I want to thank Arrive Alive, Drive Sober, who is a partner on that PSA. So that's it for me. And Dave, I'm open to any questions you might have.
Yeah, great presentation. Thanks, Richard. I've got a couple of questions that came in the queue. And the first one, and I think you touched on it, but I'm going to read it just to be sure. Are festivals permitted to license entire parks? That's up to the municipality. And if so, are they required to erect fencing as boundaries, or can they license area be an open area?
So you do have to have a designated area. In the past, it was ridiculous fencing and all this other stuff. So you still need to have a defined area. I think really what the rules say now, instead of this massive fencing, it could be just roped off, etc. I would really encourage you to do your homework on that one. And my disclaimer, of course, is I don't, the Alcohol and Gaming Commission is the ultimate authority on all this stuff, and I'm the messenger, but it definitely has changed, and I would encourage you to do a little homework on that. And
I know Jay has shared the SmartServe address in the chat bar. How can people register for the SmartServe certificate? All the details are there.
Yeah, it's on the last page, but it was smartserve.ca. There's supports, there's research, there's information that's just of general use there, and of course an opportunity to register, check your account, print off a certificate, etc. And if you run into any of those issues or problems, you're welcome to reach out to our office.
Okay. The next question comes from Lily White. If there is no date on your SmartServe card, how do you know when it expires?
So great question, Lily. When July 1 comes about and you log in, you will see a date appear on your certificate. So the plastic one that you have in your hand when it was issued, there was no expiry. But I will tell you that your certificate number has the date built into it. So, and if you want more information, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, if you try to log into your account, it will start appearing in the coming months.
Thank you. This next question is, can festivals that deliver food now deliver alcohol as well? Not without a SPO, right?
Exactly. So not only would you need a special occasion permit, you then have to apply for a separate permit and to allow for you to do delivery, which requires a lot of work and many months. So yes, you can, but it requires different permits. And the AGCO is less interested in supporting, a 2-day event with alcohol delivery than, standalone restaurants, etc. But yeah, it's a whole different process, and it is doable, but I would look into that and see if it's worth it for you.
And then one final question before we introduce Matt, and we'll bring you back at the end for some questions as well. But this comes from one of our festival producers. It's so very frustrating to deal with AGCO inspections where the week before or after your event in the exact same location with the very comparable logistics and themes with the very same inspector, you're required to have logistic restrictions more than the compared event. If my event had to have 6-foot fencing, the other events only had 4, my serving area is reduced as compared to the other. Will there now be more consistent regulations regarding inspections, more transparency? It's very frustrating to see other events with the same regional blatantly disregarding all the rules and still being able to operate. And again, I think that comes right back to, and you and I have had this discussion many times as we have with policing and everybody else, is that whole inspection process is an interpretation. And oftentimes it's the individual's personal interpretation of that legislation. Can you speak to that?
There's no question. And I think the fact that the legislation and the regulation has changed hugely, can we expect that all of the compliance officials are going to be fully up to speed? So I feel your pressure and concern. I don't work for the AGCO, so I think it really comes down to, reach out to your, inspector, compliance official, have an open communication, and I really can't offer more than that around consistency, because I don't obviously get more in depth with AGCO than that. So it sounds to me like you know what you're doing. And yes, you're going to hit those frustrations, but stay communication, keep the lines open. I think, you should be able to get there.
I'm going to slide one more in from Jen Wright. If you invite a local brewery and winery to your event, do they still need to have their own license?
So it's my understanding that they can use your special occasion permit, but they need to buy the alcohol through your special occasion permit. So if, XYZ brewery is showing up and doing sampling, they have to buy direct you through their permit. So they might bring it, but it has to be purchased through the permit. They are very aware of what the rules are when they're sampling. So certainly communicate with them and you should be fine.
And a lot of them, just like caterers, have standing SPOs that they carry with them and take to and fro events. So
yeah, they have catering endorsements that they can extend on a regular basis. Absolutely. And in some cases, you don't even need yours. So if you extend it to a third party to run it on your behalf, that's their responsibility to get the special occasion permit and less liability for you. So there's a lot of benefits to that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Richard. We'll have you back with Matt for some more questioning. At this time, I'd like to introduce Matt Maurer, who is a partner at Torkin Manes. He is the co-chair of the Cannabis Law Group and chair of the Financee Law Group. Matt provides business and regulatory advice to a wide range of cannabis industry stakeholders, including licensed producers, producer applicants, owners of businesses that provide ancillary services to the cannabis industry. He's an entrepreneur with a startup aspirations and foreign businesses who are looking to enter the Canadian market to enter into partnerships with established Canadian cannabis businesses. Welcome, Matt.
Good morning, and thank you for having me this morning. Let me just give me a second here to bring up my slides. Bear with me one second. Okay, perfect. Thank you. My name is Matt Maurer, and I'm the co-chair of Torkin Manes Cannabis Law Group. And today I'm going to be talking about the rules of cannabis legalization and how those rules impact what I would call the hospitality industry, which includes festivals, events, and say hosting people generally in a commercial setting. First, I'm going to talk about the roles that the federal and provincial and territorial governments play in establishing cannabis rules in our country. I'll then talk about age, possession, and consumption rules in the province of Ontario, as well as some rules pertaining to edible products in particular. From there, I'm going to talk about the impediments that the current laws place in front of the hospitality industry as it relates to cannabis, before finally discussing some potential solutions to those problems as well as what the future may hold. So since I only have some limited time today, let's jump right in. Now, as most of you probably know, cannabis was legalized for recreational purposes on October 17th, 2018. And that involved the legalization of dry flower, fresh flower, plants, and oils. However, the ability to commercially manufacture edibles, which includes beverages, and sell them did not occur until October of 2019. And why was that? Well, it's actually fairly simple. Our government wanted to take a conservative approach to legalization. They specifically said they want to start restrictive and sort of get more liberal as time goes on. And edibles and beverages are a tricky product. There's dosing issues, there's manufacturing issues, there's packaging issues, all these things that needed to be considered over and above what would go into legalizing just dry flower. So our government preferred to legalize the sale and use of dry flower, plants, and fresh flower, and then take its time for the next year to continue to hash out, pun not intended, the rules relating to edibles. Now, we did know that with certainty that the commercial manufacture and sale of edibles would be legal by no later than October of 2019. And we knew that because the government put a clause right in the Cannabis Act that required those edibles to become legal within a year of the law coming into force. So as such, on October 17th, 2019, edibles became legal for commercial manufacture and sale, although the products did not start hitting the shelves until about Christmas 2019. Now, I just mentioned that the Cannabis Act, which is a federal piece of legislation, and the federal government has jurisdiction over most things relating to cannabis legalization. And that includes licensing cultivators, licensing processors, setting criminal penalties, setting the minimum age for possession and consumption and sales, setting the rules on packaging and advertising, amongst other things. The list goes on and on. Now, the provinces and territories still have a very critical role to play in cannabis legalization. And that's because under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, property and civil rights fall within the purview of the provinces and territories. And as such, provinces and territories acquired two types of broad rights as it relates to cannabis legalization. First, and this is sort of taken in the first two bullet points there, or light bulbs, if you will, they were given the right to alter certain limits set by the federal government. So for example, the federal government set the minimum age for consumption and purchase at 18 years old. But provinces such as Ontario and Quebec were able to raise that minimum age higher if they wanted. Similarly, the limitation on home cultivation, which is light bulb number 3, allows for 4 plants per dwelling house. The provinces are able to lower that less than 4. And as it relates to possession limits, for example, people are allowed to walk around under the federal law with up to 30 grams of dried cannabis or their equivalent in public. Provinces are able to lower that possession limit if they so desire. Now, in addition to the first 3 sort of light bulbs there, where they get the ability to adjust things that the federal government has done, the provinces and territories were also given the right to set the rules around distribution and consumption of cannabis within their borders. And those rules around sales, distribution, and consumption are the ones that touch the hospitality industry the most. So as I said a moment ago, the federal government, let's talk about Ontario for a second, which I think I did briefly, but just in case. The federal government set the age to possession at 18 in Ontario. Ontario raised that to 19 to coincide with its minimum drinking age. So here in Ontario, if you want to consume, purchase, or possess cannabis, you have to be 19 years of age or older. What about possession? Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, in the context of the provincial federal distribution of powers, federal law allows people to possess up to 30 grams of dried cannabis or its equivalent in public. And when we say or its equivalent, there's an equivalency chart that's put right into the Cannabis Act that forms part of the legislation that talks about the different equivalency conversions. So 1 gram of dried cannabis is equivalent to 15 grams of solids containing cannabis, such as an edible, or 70 grams of non-solids containing cannabis. And so those things are really more important for manufacturers and processors. But what it ends up meaning for consumers is that you can buy up to 450 grams of edibles and about 2,100 grams of beverages. And that sounds like a hefty amount, but as we'll talk about in a bit, there's restrictions on the maximum amount of THC that can go into the products in each package. So the rules for purchase and sale are the same as the possession limits, which are up to 30 grams of dried cannabis or flower, or its equivalent in a single transaction. So if you think about it, you can walk into a store, you can buy up to 30 grams of dried flower, its equivalent, and then you can walk out and possess that same amount in public. It does create logistical problems at the retail level, the way this is shaken out, in that you could buy very low dose beverages and still only be able to purchase 5 of them because the restriction is on the total volume of the product as opposed to specifically just the amount of THC or psychoactive ingredient that's contained in it. So if you wanted to have a party and purchase a bunch of cannabis edibles or beverages, you're going to be making multiple trips to your cannabis retailer, having multiple deliveries done in order to facilitate that. So if we switch from possession to consumption, where can you consume cannabis in Ontario? Well, the cannabis rules around consumption are contained in the Smoke-Free Ontario Act of 2017, which perhaps many people here are somewhat familiar with. And those rules are far too detailed to cover comprehensively today. But in short, you can smoke or vape cannabis anywhere that you can smoke or vape tobacco. So for example, cannabis could be smoked or vaped in private residences and many outdoor spaces, as well as designated smoking guest rooms in hotels, motels, and inns. Where can't you smoke cannabis or consume cannabis? Well, when we're talking about smoking or vaping, there's a number of places where you can't. And that would be in restaurants, on bar patios, in public areas within 9 meters of a patio, outdoor grounds of a specified Ontario government office buildings, in reserved seating areas, at outdoor sports and entertainment locations, on grounds of community recreational facilities and public areas within 20 meters of those grounds, and in sheltered outdoor areas with a roof and more than 2 walls, which the public or employees frequent or invited to. A bus shelter, for example, might be an example of one of those things. As it relates to edibles and drinkables, at the moment, the only restrictions in place in consumption, as it relates to consumption, relate to vehicles. I should mention that although the provinces set the consumption rules, they can be further restricted by the various towns and municipalities. So if certain towns and municipalities have more restrictive anti-smoking measures under the Smoke Free Ontario Act, those would convert into more onerous cannabis restrictions in those municipalities as well. We've talked about the law on age for possession, possession limits where cannabis can be consumed. Let's switch to talking about rules about edibles generally. I think that's the format that's most likely in the future to touch upon those in the hospitality industry. And as it relates to edibles themselves, I alluded to this earlier, there is a limit of 10 milligrams of THC that can be included per package. No vitamins or minerals or alcohol can be added into the product, and there's restrictions on the amount of caffeine that can exist within the products. There's also many onerous packaging and labeling rules. I've included some of those details there, but it's far too nuanced to go into today. So we've talked about the law surrounding cannabis generally, as well as edibles generally. And I wanted to speak briefly about the legal impediments that the hospitality industry faces when it comes to incorporating cannabis and into festivals and events. So the first impediment relates to a block on being able to prepare and serve cannabis-infused food and beverages at an event itself. When you infuse food or create a beverage, you're technically manufacturing an edible. And in order to do so, you need a processing license from the federal government. And the problem with that license is that the requirements to obtain a processing license are onerous and really not feasible for anyone in the hospitality industry at all. Processing licenses are granted on a site-specific basis. So it's not just the company that gets licensed, it's the actual facility where they're made that gets licensed as well. And some of the requirements include having the processing facility be completely separate, a separate building from any facility where food is prepared, as well as very onerous and expensive security requirements such as camera, video storage, locks, all sorts of things that we're literally talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to build these facilities, which are designed under the legislation to be purpose-built cannabis processing or cannabis cultivation or combination thereof facilities. So absent a change in legislation, there's really no practical or economical way for someone in the event industry to license a facility on a temporary or other basis such that it could infuse food or manufacture edibles on site for the guests. So if you can't make edibles and serve them, what if venues just bought edibles prepackaged and serve them from the venue? The cannabis products do all arrive at the retail stores completely prepackaged by the manufacturer. It's a requirement in the various packaging, child-resistant packaging that it needs to come in. There's a number of rules, unfortunately, that make that problematic as well. And at a high level, under the Federal Act, organizations, which includes companies, are prohibited from even possessing cannabis unless authorized, meaning that an event or festival or hotel or motel couldn't technically even be in possession of cannabis without a license to do so. On top of that, and maybe even more explicitly, organizations are not allowed to distribute cannabis. And the definition of distribute includes administering, giving, transferring, transporting, sending, delivering, providing, or otherwise making available in any manner, whether directly or indirectly. So even if an entity could possess cannabis, distributing it would be problematic. And even buying edibles or cannabis and turning around and reselling them at the venue is problematic because you can't do so without a sales license. You're not allowed to sell cannabis unless you have a sales license. So why not just go and get a sales license so we could sell cannabis and edibles and beverages right at our venue? It's not so easy. Perhaps a little bit easier than getting a federal processing license, but a recreational retail sales license are granted by the province. And currently the requirements to get a store license don't really mesh well with what the hospitality industry would need. And I'll give you just a couple of major examples as to why it's problematic. The first is that the sales license is granted to a store, and that store is only allowed to sell cannabis, cannabis accessories, and there's a class of cannabis-related products that they're able to sell. They're not allowed to sell anything else, and explicitly not allowed to sell non-cannabis food or beverages. So basically, by selling anything else or providing any other service at a venue, it immediately disqualifies that venue from being able to obtain a cannabis sales license. But even if you could somehow obtain the sales license, and again, there's security requirements, and I'm not going to go into all of them. It's certainly not something that would be cost effective on a temporary basis. But even if you could license a venue in order to be able to sell cannabis there under the current regulatory regime, people under the age of 19 in Ontario are not allowed inside a licensed cannabis store, full stop. So if you were to license your venue, you would be effectively prohibiting anyone in the future who's under the age of 19 from attending at that venue. That might be okay for some venues. I'm not in the hospitality industry myself, so I don't know how many cater explicitly. I can think of at least one business model that does, but exclusively to people over the age of 19, 24/7, 365. But I suspect that many venues do cater to people under the age of 19 during the day or on certain days of what might be the case. And by getting a sales license, that would be it for anyone under the age of 19 attending at those places. It's just really, again, those are just two high examples, but it's really not feasible for a number of reasons, which I'd be happy to discuss with people on an individual basis in the future. We've talked about consumption, distribution, sales, and manufacturing, et cetera. We haven't talked about promotion, and I'm only going to do so at a very high level and very briefly, given how much time we have today. Basically, you can't promote cannabis. This is under the federal legislation that regulates this. You can't promote cannabis at all unless it's permitted by the legislation, which means you've got to find an exemption or an exception in order to carry out certain promotions. And there are exemptions and exceptions. But the default position is you can't promote it at all unless you're allowed to do so. The Act even goes on top of that to say, although you're not allowed to do anything unless we tell you you can do so, here's some extra things that we want to be crystal clear you're certainly not allowed to do. And sponsorship, which is relevant for our purposes today, is one of those things. So you basically, and I put the definition up here from Section 21 of the Act, in the sponsorship of a person, entity, event, activity, or facility, you can't use a brand element of cannabis, which is a defined term in the legislation. Think logos, trademarks, distinguishing guises, etc. So you can't use a brand element of a cannabis, an accessory, or a service that's related to cannabis, nor can you use the name of any company or person that does those things. So really, having a cannabis-related company sponsor an event in any shape or form becomes problematic. So doom and gloom sounds like it's heavily restrictive. It is, and that was the intention of the federal government. But I do think there's some solutions, and the future is looking bright. And I put here consumption not an issue, question mark. By and large, I think consumption is a workable problem. As I said, if you have the right sort of venue, you probably have a place already for people to smoke and vape cannabis. Certainly people can consume edibles and beverages on site, at least from a provincial standpoint. Whether municipal or facility rules change that further is a different question. But I put, sales are question mark. And that's where I think the current most unworkable problem is. How do you sell product to patrons when you effectively can't obtain a license to do so? And one option, and someone a few years ago introduced me to this acronym BOPIS, which is buy online, pick up in store. I'm going to I put BOPIS because I like the expression, but it's not quite BOPIS. One thing that an event could do, and there's nuances to it, and you'd have to be very careful because the devil's in the detail, but an arrangement could be made with local stores, one or more, to have patrons order online from the venue, depending on what that venue is, and again, it's nuanced, and having delivery made from the store right to the venue for those people who order. Delivery was never originally going to be a thing, cannabis delivery in Ontario. The pandemic came, the government gave cannabis stores curbside pickup, temporary ability to deliver. They have since indicated that that is now going to be a permanent delivery. Delivery will be permanent. I don't know if that's coming, it's either this week or next week, actually, maybe possibly the week after, that it's going to become finalized. But that does give you a sales option. But then the question is there any benefit to doing so? If you can't make any money, or you can only make a thin margin perhaps on facilitating these transactions, does giving that benefit to your patrons, is it worth all the work that goes into it? Some event organizers, and I'm not one of them, but you all are, might say it takes away from alcohol sales if people are, purchasing beverages from somewhere else. I don't think anyone would argue it's going to impact the food sales at the venue. It might actually do the reverse and increase them, but that's a business-related question for people to think about whether it makes any sense to do so. But leaving that aside, I do say that the future looks more relaxed. I think as stigma from cannabis legalization wears off, and we've seen that in the 4 years almost already that we've been there, I think that attitudes are changing. I think the demographics are changing, and I think it's becoming more acceptable. And I think it's going to become quite normal to have these products available throughout in the future. And in fact, a year or two ago, again, I'm a little bit lost on pandemic time, the provincial government started a consultation to talk about whether cannabis should be sold at special events, whether they should loosen the rules at concerts, and have cannabis cafes and lounges. I don't think that consultation ended up going very far. COVID came and pretty much derailed those sort of discussions. But I do think the hospitality industry can certainly, if it wants, make its voice heard, lobby to make changes to the federal government, and provincial laws. Really the provincial laws in this case as it relates to sales and consumption, to allow them to have events that are more cannabis friendly if that's what the industry wanted to do. So we've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time today, and I'm happy to stick around and take questions. If we don't have time, or if there's questions you don't want to ask today, or if you come up with questions later, my contact information is there. Please feel free, my email, phone number, my Twitter account, reach out. I'm happy to answer questions that anyone might have in the future. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and want to thank you all very much for taking the time to attend today.
Well, thanks very much, Matt, and thank you again, Richard. Yeah, a lot of grayish area there, and Matt, I've served on a lot of roundtables and task force with the Minister, the Attorney General, and everything you talked about there are the points that we're trying to figure out how to make that happen. Because, like you said, the only way we can see that you can sell it on your property or on premises is to have some sort of SOP. And it doesn't make sense for event organizers to be buying a couple $100 pounds of pot to sell at their events. So, somebody that already holds that license, has gone through the proper training and procedures of storage and safety and security and everything else, they should be the ones that are able to do it. But I think the bigger problem still is, and Richard, maybe you can jump in here, and Matt, you touched on it, and I know Richard and I have had this conversation for the last 3 years, is where is the profit margin in pot right now? Because, I mean, if you're holding a liquor license and you don't have the ability to monetize cannabis, either through promotion or whatever, why would you do it, since it does have a direct effect on your liquor license? Richard, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Matt's smiling, so I'll probably detour it back to him. There's no question that the licenses stand alone and are separate entities, and there's the moral issue of offering both, and liability of ensuring that someone who may be under the influence of cannabis then doesn't come into a licensed area, and then having to manage that. So they're two very different scenarios. I don't know enough about the cannabis side, which is why I was thrilled that Matt was able to join us today. So I'm going to defer the rest of that over to Matt. You're on mute, Matt.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, it's a complicated thing, and I think we're still finding our ways through this. And Richard and I have talked about this over the years, that sort of the commingling of alcohol and cannabis has its inherent problems. It has inebriation problems and server issues and things to recognize. And it creates business problems as well. As I said, earlier, is this the kind of thing that people want to jump through hoops to give to their patrons? When I would suggest, and again, I'm not the expert, but perhaps more Richard than me, the margins on alcohol sales and things of that nature are quite probably better, and I think until we get to a point where cannabis retail can happen at events. And ironically enough, literally this morning, I saw something out of Alberta that Alberta is going to a delivery model as well, and they weren't allowed to do that before. And they've confirmed the Alberta Gaming and Lottery Commission, I think it is, that you can deliver to events and festivals in Alberta with the new delivery rules. So that's, as I said, the door is starting to open a crack, and I think there's going to be more opportunities in the future.
We've got a couple of questions here. Christine Kane asks, what about promoting CBD products? They don't have THC in them. Are we allowed to recruit a sponsorship, or is that still considered cannabis?
Good question. It is still considered cannabis. I'd have to go back and look at what the definition of cannabis is. But basically, if it comes, the short version is in the Federal Act, if it comes from the cannabis plant, it's cannabis. Now, if it comes from if the potency is under, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's pretty low, it technically then becomes hemp, and it's covered under the industrial hemp regulation. So CBD is also, it's a great question because it's also fascinating. Many of you have probably seen it in grocery stores, maybe in the States for sure. At convenience stores, there seems to be a lot of CBD products. And there's been another consultation about that to say, well, it's not like THC. It's treated more of a wellness product by people in the industry. So why do I have to go to a specialized store and pick those up? Why can't I have, if we're having a yoga retreat or a wellness event and we want to have some CBD oil or some CBD, what's the big deal? And I think a lot of that is just politicians and people generally starting to wrap their head around what cannabis is and what it's not, and the different ways and shapes it can take form.
The next question comes from Tasha, and it's further clarification. Cannabis stores can't participate as a vendor of events. For example, we host a street festival that includes vendors. Many of the vendors are storefronts within the event area. There is a cannabis store in the event area. Would they not be permitted to set up as a vendor for marketing purposes? Well, possibly. This is all these fun questions I get sort of all those gray areas, right?
I mean, yeah, and that's really, the devil really is in the details, because I'll just throw out some, other examples. If it's a B2B event, and there's a technical way to meet B2B in cannabis under the legislation, the promotion rules go out the window. To have a cannabis store as part of your event, festival, if you will, I think is okay, as long as that cannabis store isn't sponsoring the event. What they're trying to get away from is, Festivals Event Ontario presented by Fire and Flower or Tokyo Smoke, and trying to allow cannabis companies to, sort of advertise in that fashion. But I think to have a store in that type of event is probably fine. It would be the store, actually, more than anything, that would need to be very mindful about what they did and didn't do outside the front doors of those stores.
And Jay, if you can just put Matt's contact information back up in chat, some people are just looking for it. Richard, I wanted to, we had the conversation beforehand, and for some people that may not know, Richard also serves on the board of the Sound of Music in Burlington. And I know back in 2020, you and your board had played with the idea, and maybe even for this year, you're toying with the idea. What are some of the issues that from the board level you guys are thinking about, Richard?
Yeah, there's no question that in the early days, and again, Matt's very aware of this, that, the large cannabis companies were throwing all kinds of money at events, but, you had to do your homework and you had to understand your liability. So as a board member, our homework at that time, and I think the rules are still the same, is let's, XYZ company throws money at you. So then you have to set up an area, and in our case, we thought, okay, we'll put them in a licensed area, but then they, at that time, and again, I think it's still the same, could not promote the product, couldn't have any branding, and so it didn't make a lot of sense. However, they were still interested in doing it. So in other words, the public, general public, and children and those that weren't of age were not allowed to see anything related to the brand or even that it was cannabis. So we kind of evaluated that, and we thought, if Health Canada gets a complaint at your event because someone doesn't like it there or whatever, it just leads to a lot of challenges for you as an organization. So when we weighed how much money they were willing to pay, what our potential liability and hassle was, we chose to not go down that road. I believe things have lightened a bit, as Matt's referred to, and I'll let him speak to that specifically. But yeah, it wasn't as simple as taking the money, Dave. There was a lot attached to it.
I'll say I had a recent experience, and I'm still going through it to some extent, of to the extent that there's venue owners here today. There's cannabis companies that want to rent event space to do certain things, and obviously you've got to do your homework before you rent out to them. But the one I'm thinking of in particular, they've done all their homework. We've sort of talked through how could this work, what's compliant, what's worked, and we get all the way to the point where we're about to sign the contract, and the venue says, "Well, I'd like some reassurance from Health Canada or the AGCO that what you're saying is okay." And I'll sort of tell everyone that that's never going to happen. I don't know what Richard's experience is with the AGCO, but certainly both of them as it relates to cannabis. And we've seen this from when the licensing of the stores, people might be familiar that there was a lottery in Ontario. First, they gave them out 25 at a time through a lottery, and then I think there was another 42. And, basically they just said, we don't provide legal advice. If you have a question about interpreting the rules, sorry, we're not going to answer it. Do what you want to do. And what frustrates me is that afterwards they'll say, if we don't like it, we'll tell you that. But all of this to say, if you've got a venue and there's a cannabis company looking to do something, there are ways it can be done. There's certainly, like I said, exemptions and exceptions, and we shouldn't be so quick to just sort of shut them down and to work with them. But to the extent that anyone's looking for assurances from the regulator that everything is on the up and up, it's just never going to happen.
Got a question in our chat. Can a cannabis company be on an event site with no product, just as an information booth?
Probably, certainly in the right context. So I'll give you one of those examples is if cannabis companies are allowed to do what's called an informational promotion, which is to provide factual information about their company, their service, or the cannabis products themselves. There's different ways they can do that. They can do it online if it's in an age-gated environment, or you can do it in person. And there's a little bit of a disagreement as to how this is triggered, but if it's done in a place where young persons are not permitted by law, then absolutely. So you could have cannabis companies at a place where young persons are not permitted, and they could do all sorts of promoting. They can bring products. They could potentially display products depending on the details of the event. So it's really, you kind of have to think through these things. And the debatable part is, let's say you've got a Boston Pizza or some other restaurant, or maybe Boston Pizza is not the best example, I don't know, because I'm not familiar, but let's pick an establishment like a pub, for example, that during the day you can go in with your kids and have lunch, but as of 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, it's 19 over only from that point forward. Well, the question is that a place where young persons are not permitted by law after 9 p.m., or does it not qualify because during the day they are permitted? So put differently, do they have to be not permitted 24/7? And again, trying to get some answers out of the regulator is difficult at best. Health Canada can take 7 or 8 months to respond to an email in the best of times. But these are the things, there's, and I think Richard would say the same, there's just uncertainty. And a lot of that is because our government created this wonderful comprehensive legislative scheme. It's very long, it's got all these regulations, but it was done in the abstract. And then once it kind of hits the ground and people start implementing it, you start to see where the gaps are and where these weird things are, such as, for example, you can only walk out with 5 cans of a 0.5 milligram THC drink, which is very low dose. But you could also walk out with 5 of 10 THC milligram drinks, which is for some people quite high. And so, it kind of creates this illogical distinction between, or lack of distinction, where you can only walk out with 5 cans, regardless of how potent it is to begin with.
Richard and Matt, thank you very much. A lot of great information. Again, we could probably go days and days on all of this stuff, but really thanks to both of you for joining us today.
Thanks, Dave. Good luck to everybody with your events this year.
And just a reminder to everybody that we're taking next week off because of March break, letting you enjoy some time with your families, and we'll be back on scene for our Tuesday talk on Tuesday, March 22nd. At this time, I'd like to thank Festival Events Ontario. We'd like to thank our sponsors for making Energize happen: the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, Culture Industries, Destination Ontario, OLG, SmartServe Ontario, and our friends at Ticket Pro. Until Tuesday, March 22nd, enjoy your March break with your family, everybody.